Three nations just did something that Bible prophecy students should be paying attention to, and that's Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Now, on August 7th, 2026, the leaders of these three particular Muslim nations, mainly Sunni, met in Mecca, and they signed what is called now the Mecca Joint Defence Agreement. And the language of this agreement is very interesting. The gist of it is an armed attack against one of these nations will be regarded as an attack against all three. Now, what's even more striking in this agreement, it's reported that it's open to additional nations. And guess what? Egypt already has been discussed as a possible future participant. Now, let's be clear here from the beginning. I'm not saying that Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia are three of Daniel's 10 toes in the 10-toed kingdom, but I'm asking the prophetic question. Could we be watching the framework of a future confederacy beginning to form, namely Daniel's 10-toed kingdom as it was depicted by King Nebuchadnezzar's dream and interpreted by Daniel? Why? Because Daniel did see a final 10-toed kingdom composed of iron and clay. And then that was reaffirmed by the Apostle John in Revelation chapter 13. He saw a 10-horn beast, which represented 10 kings who ultimately surrendered their authority and their dominions to the beast or the Antichrist. So now we have three powerful Islamic nations that have suddenly entered into a collective defense agreement that, in all intents and purposes, could grow into 10 nations or kingdoms. So today on Rapture Insights, I'm asking the question, is Daniel's 10-toed kingdom beginning to take shape? Well, I am your host, Pastor Marcus Brantley, and I'm glad you're tuning in to another episode of Rapture Insights, which is your premier and trusted channel for everything pertaining to the rapture, as well as eschatology, which is the study of the last things or the study of the end times. So let's get right into it. What just happened in Mecca? Well, let's first separate the news from prophecy. And the news is verifiable. It is known and it's been reported that Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia signed the Mecca Joint Defense Agreement on August 7th. That's a fact. And the agreement, as I mentioned earlier, states an attack on one is an attack on all three. And that's very interesting because that kind of mirrors a provision in the NATO treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, officials have emphasized that the pact is defensive as opposed to being offensive. And it's not officially directed against any particular country, even though these three nations are Sunni. And of course, Iran is Shia. And we know that Sunni nations and Shia nations, although they're Islamic, they don't necessarily like each other. But that's for another episode to talk about the rift between the Sunni Muslim nations and the Shia, namely Iran. So it's not being reported as against any particular country like Iran, and it doesn't replace any of the existing alliances, like, for instance, Saudi Arabia's alliance with America. That has not changed. And I don't think America is interpreting, rather, that it does change anything between the two countries. But the agreement does call for deeper defense cooperation and a collective deterrence. And I think that's evident. Subsequent reporting also mentions that The countries intend to develop political and military coordination systems, as well as expanding joint exercises, and then have cooperation in areas that include defense technology. Now, just think about what each of these countries bring to the table. Now, we know that Turkey possesses one of the region's most capable conventional militaries, and it's also a NATO member. Pakistan is a nuclear armed Muslim majority nation. We mentioned Sunni. And then also Saudi Arabia brings extraordinary financial resources. They're a rich nation, heavy in oil influence, political significance, and they're primarily the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites, one of them being Mecca, where they met for this defense agreement. Now, that represents three very different kinds of power. Turkey, military power; Pakistan, nuclear power; and of course, Saudi Arabia, economic power. And that significance for that to come together under one defense framework. And therefore, as students of prophecy, you have to take notice of this, because this may develop into something significant, especially if they're open to others joining, and Egypt is right on cue to participate. Now, when we think of these nations being the three toes of Daniel's 10-toe kingdom, we're speaking of Daniel chapter 2 in the Old Testament, where King Nebuchadnezzar, for those that may not know, had a dream that was very disturbing. And in this dream, he saw this huge image that had a head of gold. It had chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, and it also had legs of iron. And then when Daniel saw the feet, or rather when Nebuchadnezzar recounted the dream and saw the feet, he indicated that these feet were of iron mixed with clay, which kind of represented a kingdom that is together but divided. And the iron represents strength, but the clay represents fragility. Now, just think about these three nations and what they represent. Two of the nations are militarily strong, right? We mentioned Turkey having the military muster. We mentioned Pakistan being a nuclear power, but we know Saudi Arabia militarily is fragile. They are not militarily strong, although they have economic influence and economic strength. But that kind of gives us that sort of iron and clay mixed dynamic. And then Daniel in chapter 2, verse 43 mentions that they shall not cleave one to another. Now, they're together, they're forming this agreement, but just having a defense agreement doesn't mean that you're solidly in lockstep together, as if you were just iron, like the two legs of iron that precedes this 10-toed kingdom, the iron legs that represented the Roman Empire. But it's nevertheless fascinating that these nations have come together to form this alliance. So Daniel gave the interpretation of this statue, and that the last kingdom, which is the last nation, Gentile nation, to rule planet Earth prior to the coming of Jesus Christ, when he establishes his millennial kingdom for 1,000 years. So this 10-toed kingdom is the last of Gentile rule. And we know that it's a confederacy of nations. Now, what's interesting is that this 10-toed kingdom comes after the legs of iron that I just mentioned, which is the Roman Empire. So therefore, the iron portion of the feet represent an extension of the Roman Empire, but it's not just purely Roman as it was back in the days of Jesus Christ in BC and then in parts of AD. But what we see is that there are two theories as to who this 10-toed kingdom will turn out to be. And the first theory, some are saying because Rome had split into two parts or two legs, if you will. And one of the legs was the Western Roman Empire. Now, we know that the two capitals of these two legs, so to speak, and in this instance, the 2 feet, we had the Western Empire, which today still is headquartered in Rome, the Vatican. And that is pretty much the cradle of European civilization, if you will. It stems out of the Western wing of the Roman Empire. And some theorize that because of this Western wing of the Roman Empire, that Europe, namely the European Union, will be the 10-toed kingdom that Daniel foresaw when he interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, that's one camp. That's one theory. Now, because we mentioned that the Roman Empire had 2 legs of iron, there has to be another wing or another leg. Rome being the western leg, and now let's look at the eastern leg. Because when the Roman Empire did split, the West went to and established itself in Rome, and then there was a established eastern headquarters in what was called then Constantinople. And Constantinople was the capital of Asia Minor in that time, which is modern day Turkey. And then later, Turkey became, or the capital became Istanbul, which is the capital today. That's the eastern leg. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why are there 2 legs of the Roman Empire represented by the legs of iron? Well, think about it. In that statue, if we can just back it up a little bit, there were the arms and chest of silver that represented the kingdom that would come after the head of gold, which was Babylon. Now, the chest and arms represented the Medes and the Persian Empire. So it was a twofold kingdom as well, represented by the 2 arms of silver. Coming out of the one chest of silver, because they were one nation with 2 wings, if you will. Similarly, the 2 legs of iron representing a split. Now, the Medes and the Persians, their empire didn't split. It was just a twofold kingdom, Media and Persia, but it was still one nation. That's why the chest of silver was there. But when it came to the Roman Empire, the legs of iron, Rome did split and became separate. Not only did Rome split into those 2 headquarters, the one western wing being in Rome, the eastern wing being in Constantinople, later on, the eastern wing was overtaken by Islamic forces, and Turkey, which is modern day Asia Minor, Constantinople, it became the Ottoman Empire. And later, it was named Turkey. So those are the 2 camps. And historically, those that sort of are students of prophecy believe, and still do to a certain extent, that the Western wing will be where the 10-toed kingdom will arise out of, that beast that John saw in Revelation 13, that it will come from Europe. And people are looking at the European Union. Now, that may be the case, but in the context of what's happening today, when we see these three nations coming together and Turkey being at the forefront, which is representative of the eastern wing of the Roman Empire, knowing that the 10-toed nation will be a revised Rome, we now have a second theory, in that we are seeing the formation of a potential 10-toed kingdom that is coming not out of the west, but is coming out of the east. And you see that these three nations are formidable. They are not fly by night nations. They are powerful, and they're welcoming other nations to join them. So that's an interesting dynamic. And Turkey is a nation to look out for. Not only that, when we think of Daniel chapter 2, you also have to look at it in the context of Ezekiel 38, because Turkey appears in that major prophetic conversation, if you will, because it speaks of Gog that forms a coalition to come against Israel. Now, it speaks geographically as Gog being from the land of Magog, which is going to be this confederacy that comes down from the north against Israel. Now, classically speaking, there are those that believe that the land of Magog is Russia. That appears to be the predominant view. But you also have to look at Turkey, because when you look at Turkey, Turkey is also north. It may not be as northward as Russia is, but it is nevertheless north of Israel. So potentially Turkey can fit that description as well, especially when you think in the context of all of the other nations that are described in Ezekiel 38, not just Magog. And these pretty much are the sons of Japheth, by the way. So not only Magog, but Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Beth Togarmah. And then also those groups will be in alliance with Persia, which is Iran, Cush, which is Libya, or rather Cush, which is Ethiopia / Sudan, and then also Put, which is Libya. So we know that Turkey may not be the leader of Ezekiel 38, the Battle of Armageddon, but it is definitely a main nation, a main figure that will be in that confederacy of nations to come against Israel. And it would fit perfectly if Turkey is the head of this 10-toed kingdom that Daniel saw, as well as this confederacy of nations that Ezekiel saw in Ezekiel 38 and then later in Ezekiel 39. Now, am I telling you that Turkey is definitely Gog of the land of Magog? No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that it is absolutely a candidate, not only because of the fact that it's strategically and geographically north of Israel, but the simple fact that it is an Islamic nation that is very powerful and that is now forging alliances. Now, these alliances in this 10-toed kingdom, remember, it's iron mixed with clay. So they will be strong, but they will not cleave. They will not be solidified. They will still be divided. And now, while these nations are very powerful, they're not identical, as we mentioned. Military systems are different. Even their national interests are different. Political cultures are different. Although they are Sunni majority nations, they still have their alliances are displayed differently, as well as Turkey being a part of NATO. Also, Pakistan has deep strategic ties with China. And then also Saudi Arabia has historically been tied and relied on its U.S. security relationships. So this kind of aligns with the whole iron and clay characteristic of the 10-toed nation, or the 10-toed confederacy, because it's illustrating what Daniel saw, this confederacy of separate powers with different strengths and different interests coming together. So now let's look at our thumbnail that we put on display. 3 now, 10 later. Now, yes, I'm not predicting that this agreement will form with 7 additional members to form this 10-toed kingdom. What I am saying is that your antenna should go up and your eyes should be open, because Egypt is right around the corner for being a part of it. So it's sort of laying down a framework, an architecture for broader cooperation between the various nations, including the original 3. And we know that in Revelation 13 that these nations will cede their authority and power to the Antichrist, who John saw as one of the heads of the beast that arises out of the sea. So it's something to definitely take note of. So what happened, to recap, in Mecca? Maybe it's just simply 3 nations that decided to respond to what's going on geopolitically in the Middle East and in their sphere of influence. And that's entirely possible. And maybe this agreement may just be with those 3 nations. Maybe eventually it will fade away. But if you're a student of prophecy, you won't ignore what it could potentially represent. And that's 3 significantly powerful Muslim majority nations, right now all Sunni, that have entered into this mutual defense arrangement. And this agreement is open for expansion. So we're going to end it right there, because I can go on about this and talk about the 10-toed kingdoms in detail, and the Antichrist and the tribulation period, but we're not going to do that. We just want to give you a brief synopsis so that you can then do your own research and study when it comes to the end times. All right. Well, this is Pastor Marquez Brantley, your host of Rapture Insights, your premier and trusted channel for everything pertaining to the rapture, including eschatology, which is the study of the last things or the last days. And if you haven't subscribed, why don't you hit the subscribe button? If this was of value to you, this episode, why don't you hit the like button as well? Help me to grow this channel. And let me just also say that these episodes are not to fearmonger. It is just for us to look up and know as believers that our redemption draweth nigh. Thank you for tuning in. Hope to see you on next week. God willing. Shalom, shalom. Be blessed.